Ethan Walker bought the land no one else wanted. It sat at the edge of a narrow canyon in southern Colorado, where wind howled like it had something personal to prove. The real estate agent called it challenging. The locals called it useless rock. A limestone cliff rose straight up along the back of the property, pale and unwelcoming, like a wall that had been standing there long before anyone thought to argue with it. To Ethan, it looked like shelter. Ethan was a quiet, stubborn man with calloused hands and an old pickup that rattled like loose change in a jar. He worked construction when he could find it and fixed fences when he couldn't. His wife, Sarah, followed him out west with their 8-year-old son, Jacob, because hope was cheaper than rent and stronger than fear. But when the neighbors saw what Ethan planned to build, hope turned into laughter. Instead of stacking logs and laying stone for a chimney, Ethan started carving into the cliff itself. Day after day, he chipped away at the rock, shaping a hollow space where the stone curved inward. He framed the front with timber and filled it with glass. Big windows, small windows, even pieces cut from old bottles. No fireplace, no stove, no chimney. Tom Reed, who owned the nearest ranch, watched from horseback with a skeptical frown. "Walker," he called out one afternoon, "you planning to freeze your family to death in there?" Ethan wiped dust from his beard. "I'm building into the rock." Tom snorted. "That's a cave, not a house." "It's shelter," Ethan said calmly. "Stone holds warmth. Sun feeds it." Word spread fast. At the feed store, men shook their heads. "He's building a glass box in a cliff. No heat source at all. That kid won't last one winter." Sarah tried to smile through it, but fear settled in her chest like a slow ache. At night, she lay awake listening to the wind claw at their temporary trailer. "What if they're right?" she whispered. "What if the cold gets inside?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He just reached for her hand. "My father used to say the earth remembers warmth," he said. "We just forgot how to listen." Jacob, curious and barefoot, ran his fingers along the carved stone walls as they took shape. "It feels cool now," he said. "It won't later," Ethan replied. "Sun will wake it up." By late autumn, the house was finished. A single room pressed into living rock, its front sealed with glass facing south. The stone walls were thick and dark, the floor laid with smooth river stones that drank in light. From the outside, it looked strange. From the inside, it felt steady. Still, the valley waited. Winter was coming, and everyone was certain Ethan Walker had built a beautiful mistake. Except Ethan. The first frost came early, creeping over the canyon like an uninvited guest. By mid-October, the grass along the road turned silver every morning, and the creek ran thin and dark beneath a skin of ice. Folks in the valley were already stacking firewood higher than their fences. Ethan Walker did nothing of the sort. Instead, he finished sealing the glass wall, pressing thick putty into every crack until the frame looked like it had grown there. The windows faced south, catching the low autumn sun from dawn until late afternoon. By the time the last pane was set, the inside of the stone room smelled faintly of resin and dust and something warm he couldn't name. The neighbors came by out of curiosity more than kindness. Tom Reed rode up one afternoon and dismounted slowly, eyeing the glass front like it might shatter if he stared too hard. "You really gonna live through winter without a stove?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Stone doesn't forget heat." Tom stepped inside and shifted his boots on the dark riverstone floor. "Feels warm now," he admitted, "but it's October. Sun makes fools of us all this time of year." "Touch the back wall," Ethan said. Tom pressed his palm against the limestone and frowned. "That part's warm, too." "The sun never reaches there," Ethan replied. "That warmth comes from the earth." Tom said nothing after that, but his face held the look of a man who wasn't ready to believe and wasn't ready to walk away either. Sarah tried to settle into the new home with brave routines, sweeping the stone floor, hanging blankets along the wall near Jacob's sleeping space, cooking on a small iron brazier near the glass front when the air felt still. She kept the vent cracked open when she cooked, watching the steam drift into the cold outside like breath leaving a body. Some nights fear still won. She would wake before dawn and press her hand against the back wall. It was never cold, not once. Cool, yes, but steady, predictable. The kind of temperature that didn't panic. Jacob noticed first. One morning after a night when the outside thermometer dipped below freezing, he climbed down from his blankets and ran barefoot across the stone floor. "Mom," he said, surprised, "it's not cold." Sarah knelt and touched the floor herself. It held the faint warmth of yesterday's sun, stored like a secret. By late November, the gossip in town had changed tone. He's still alive. They haven't lit a fire yet. Maybe the cliff really does something. The wind grew sharper. It searched every cabin in the valley, finding loose boards and tired mortar. But when it slammed against Ethan's home, it found only glass and stone. No gaps, no seams, just solid resistance. Inside, the light moved slowly across the floor each day, climbing the wall like a patient animal and sinking back down again by evening. The room warmed in the afternoon and cooled gently at night, never dropping into the cruel cold that owned the land outside. Still, winter hadn't shown its teeth yet. Tom Reed passed by again one gray morning and called out, "Enjoy it while you can, Walker. January's the judge." Ethan watched him right away, his breath fogging the air. He wasn't afraid of January. He was waiting for it. Because if the stone was going to fail, it would fail loudly. And if it was going to hold, it would change everything. January came down from the mountains like it had a grudge. The first storm buried the road in white silence. The second drove the temperature so low, the creek stopped moving altogether. By the third, the wind began to scream through the canyon, forcing itself into every crack and knot of every house that dared stand in its way. Wood smoke hung over the valley day and night. Chimneys burned like signal fires. Men rose before dawn to split frozen logs, their breath turning solid in the air. Women kept kettles boiling just to keep hands from stiffening. Children slept in coats. At Tom Reed's ranch, the fire never rested. Still, the cold crept along the floorboards like a living thing. His youngest boy coughed through the night, and his wife wrapped him in quilts that smelled of smoke and fear. "Coldest winter I've ever seen," Tom muttered, feeding the stove again. "And it ain't done yet." 3 miles away, Ethan Walker woke before sunrise to a different kind of quiet. Inside the stone house, the air felt heavy and calm. The glass wall was coated with frost on the outside, but inside, the room held steady. Ethan sat up and checked the small thermometer he'd hung near the door. 52 degrees. No fire, no stove, no smoke. Sarah stirred beside him. "How cold is it out there?" Ethan cracked the door just long enough for a blade of winter to cut inside. The air outside bit like teeth. He shut it again quickly. "Cold enough to scare a man," he said. Jacob climbed down from his blankets and padded across the stone floor. He pressed his hands against the back wall and smiled. "It's warm again." The storm worsened. Snow piled against fences. The road vanished. The wind howled so hard it bent the trees along the ridge. By the third night of sub-zero cold, trouble reached the valley. A chimney cracked at the Morales cabin. Smoke backed into their house, choking the air. They burned smaller fires, but the cold pressed in anyway. Their youngest daughter shivered even under 3 blankets. At Tom Reed's place, the woodpile dropped fast. Half his winter supply vanished in a week. The fire roared, but the floor stayed frozen. He woke at midnight and again at 3 just to keep the stove alive. "Physics is winning," he said to no one. Then he remembered the cliff. On the 4th day of the cold snap, Tom rode through blowing snow to Ethan's place. He tied his horse with numb fingers and stood staring at the glass wall, half expecting to see ice inside. Instead, he saw light. He knocked once, twice. Ethan opened the door. Warmth spilled out like a held breath. Tom stepped inside and stopped dead. The air wrapped around him, gentle and even. Not stove hot, not smoky, just steady. "Where's the fire?" he asked. "There isn't one," Ethan said. Tom knelt and touched the floor. Warm. He pressed both palms against the stone wall. Warmer still. "This don't make sense," he whispered. "It makes a different kind of sense," Ethan replied. "Stone keeps what the earth gives it. Sun feeds it. Wind can't steal it." Tom's shoulders sagged. "My boy's been coughing for 3 days. We can't keep the floor warm." "Bring him here," Ethan said. "There's room." That night, the storm raged on. And for the first time, the valley understood something new. Winter could be fought with fire, or it could be outwitted with stone. And only one of those ways didn't cost blood. Tom Reed didn't go home that night. He sent a ranch hand back for his family instead. By midnight, the wind was tearing through the canyon like it meant to scrape the earth clean. Snow rattled against the glass wall of Ethan's house, but inside the air stayed calm and watchful, like the stone itself was standing guard. Tom's wife arrived first, carrying their youngest boy wrapped in every blanket they owned. The child's lips were pale, his cough thin and tired. Sarah guided them inside and laid the boy near the back wall where the stone felt warmest. Within minutes, his breathing slowed. Tom watched it happen with the stunned look of a man who had spent his whole life believing in fire. The next morning, word spread through the valley faster than the storm. The Morales family came next, their chimney still cracked and useless. Then a sheep herder from the upper ridge arrived with frostbitten hands. By the second night, Ethan's single-room stone house held three families, sharing soup, sharing blankets, sharing the strange comfort of warm rock beneath their palms. No one joked anymore. Men who had once laughed at the glass cave now stood silent, pressing their hands to the walls like they were touching something holy. Women whispered to each other about how the air didn't sting their lungs. Children slept without coats for the first time in days. Tom sat on one of Ethan's wooden chairs and stared at the stone floor, glowing faintly in the afternoon sun. "It's warm everywhere," he said. "Not just by one spot. The heat doesn't come from one place," Ethan answered. "It comes from all of it." Outside, the storm still ruled the land. Fences vanished under snowdrifts. Trees bent low. Smoke from distant chimneys thinned as wood ran out. Inside the stone house, time moved differently. The light crept across the floor each day and climbed the wall like it was learning how to live there. At night, the warmth stayed, slow and patient. No one woke to feed a fire. No one coughed themselves into exhaustion. On the third day, Tom finally spoke what everyone else was thinking. "You could have kept this to yourself." Ethan looked at him. "For what?" "So your family stays warm while the rest of us freeze." Ethan shook his head. "Stone doesn't belong to me. Sun doesn't belong to me. What sense would it make to hoard them?" That afternoon, when the wind dropped enough for men to work outside, Tom followed Ethan along the canyon wall. They stood where the cliff faced south, bright even in winter light. "You think this could work for other houses?" Tom asked. "It already does," Ethan said. "People just forgot how to build with it." They sketched shapes in the snow with a stick. Walls facing the sun, thick stone for the back, dark floors to hold heat. It wasn't magic. It was direction and weight and patience. By the end of the week, the storm broke. The sky cleared into a hard, bright blue that hurt to look at. The valley stepped out into a world that looked newly made and newly cruel. But something had changed. The families who walked home from Ethan's place did not walk back the same way they came. They left carrying more than warmth in their coats. They carried a new idea of shelter. Tom Reed cut his firewood in half that spring. The Morales family rebuilt their cabin with a stone wall facing the sun. People began talking about sun houses instead of log houses. And every time someone asked how it worked, Tom would say, "You don't fight winter, you make it miss." The house in the cliff still stood quiet and solid, its glass front catching the light, its stone walls holding what the earth had given them. What began as a mistake had become the safest place in the valley. And everyone knew it now. Spring came late that year, like it was embarrassed by what winter had done. Snow still clung to the shaded parts of the canyon when the first grass pushed through, thin and stubborn. People stepped outside their cabins with tired faces and empty wood piles, looking at the land as if it had personally wronged them. But something was different now. On the south side of the valley, new walls were rising. Stone walls, dark floors, big windows facing the sun. Not fancy, not perfect, but deliberate. Tom Reed built first. Where his old cabin once fought the wind, he added a thick stone wall and wide glass windows that caught the winter light. The next cold season, his stove stayed quiet more often than not. His boy stopped coughing. His wife stopped sleeping in her coat. The Morales family followed. Then the sheep herder from the ridge. Then two ranchers from the far end of the valley who had nearly lost everything to frost. People stopped calling it Ethan's glass cave. They started calling it the warm house. Ethan never charged anyone for what he showed them. He walked property lines with a stick, drawing shapes in the dirt, where to face the windows, where to pile stone, where to keep the wind out. Sarah brought coffee to men who once mocked her husband. Jacob grew taller watching walls rise that looked a little like their own. Years passed. The cliff house stayed the same, quiet, grounded, patient. Its glass panes were replaced once after a hailstorm. The stone never needed fixing. When Ethan got older, he liked to sit near the back wall in the afternoon and let the warmth creep into his bones. Sometimes Jacob sat with him. "Why didn't anyone think of this before?" Jacob asked once. "They did," Ethan said. "Long before us, we just forgot." The valley never forgot again. Winters still came. They always would. But they didn't come as enemies anymore. They came as something to plan for, something to shape around, something that no longer owned the people who lived there. And the house in the cliff still caught the sun, still held it, still gave it back. All because one man believed stone could remember what fire forgot. So here's the question for you. If everyone around you says something can't work, but nature quietly proves it can, who would you listen to? Would you build like everyone else? Or would you trust what the earth is already offering? And how many glass caves have been laughed at in history before they became the thing that saved people? If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, or if it made you see shelter, winter, or courage a little differently, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming. Stories about people who were mocked until they were right. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what would you build if winter came for your home? Because sometimes the warmest place is the one nobody believed in first.